Let's take a look at tables. This video is number 4 in the Java GUI series on this channel. After having talked about actionlessness in the last video, we can dive deeper into building up tables. So, in short, JTable is a Java Swing component used to display and edit two-dimensional data in a tabular format, similar to a spreadsheet. It presents data in rows and columns and supports the typical features you'd expect when working with tables. In this video, we'll build up 3 table examples, which would be a basic example followed by a filter and sort example, as well as another example showing how to add and delete rows. Let's start right away with a simple example in which we create a simple Java Swing GUI with a table and a few values. Okay, now we will start within the main method. But before we will get busy here, let's create a new class simple table example and also add a run method. In here we start by defining our frame and by also setting the title simple table example. We also need to define how to close the window, and to do that we use set default close operation and set it to exit on close. Now the window also needs a size and we set it to 400 by 300. Alright, now let's start by creating a sample data. For that we create a two-dimensional array of objects which we name data. And in here we put the entries for John Doe, Jane Smith and Peter Jones. Now let's create the table object for that. So the first thing that we want to do is define the columns that we need, which is ID, a first name and a last name. And now let's put all this in an object named the default table model, which links the data that we just defined and the column names that we just defined. Okay, we are ready now to define the actual table, which is done by making use of JTable and providing the model. Now, the contents of the table can get bigger than the window that we just defined at 400 by 300. So let's also define a JScroll pane and put the table into there so that we get the little bars to be able to move the content. Alright, now let's add the scroll pane to the frame and set the frame to visible true. Alright, let's go back to the main method and add the simple table example class that we just created and name it example1 and run the run method. Now let's run the application. And here we can see our simple table example window, having the size of 400 by 300. In here we have the table that we just defined, including the data that we added. Now that we have covered the table basics, we can move up a bit and check out how to filter table values and how to sort them by column. Alright, we are back to the main method. And just like in the example before, let's start by creating the class table filter sort example. And let's also make sure we add a run method. We start by defining ourselves a frame with the title table filter sort example. We also set the default close operation to exit on close and the size to 400 by 300. Now let's also add data, again in a two-dimensional object array, which consists of John Doe, Jane Smith, Peter Jones and Alice Brown. Compared to the other example that we just created before, you can see that we added a column, which is the status whether the user is active or not. Alright, now let's create the table, starting by defining the column names in the string array, which are ID, first name, last name, and is active. Alright, now let's create the default table model and add the data and the column names. And this time let's also override the getColumn class method to make sure that the last column is a boolean, which we will use for a checkbox in the editor. And we do this with this line here, which essentially checks whether this method was called to get the type for the last column. And if so, it will define the column as a boolean, and if not, it will define it as a string. Now let's also override the isCellEditable method and make sure to only have the isActive column editable, which is the last column. Alright, now let's actually create the table by creating a new JTable object and provide the model. Let's also put the table into a JScroll pane. Now let's also define a new object table row sorter and provide the model, and then set this sorter to the table that we just created. This basically enables sorting. Now we also want to be able to filter. So for that, let's create a new panel with a border layout. Then let's add a new label, which we name filter. And let's also define a new JText field to be able to enter something that we're going to use for filtering. Now let's add a new document listener to this text field. And in here we override the changedUpdate method. Now, as we want to do some filtering here, we also want to make sure that the filter text that we entered is in the right format. So let's trim it and count its length then. And if its length is 0, then there's no need for a filter because we basically entered nothing. But in case it's not 0, it means that we have something that we can use as a filter. So let's add that to the sorter by making use of the setRowFilter method and add this as a regex filter. Just believe me in this, it will become clear in just a second when we execute it. And also make sure you play around with this to make really sure you understand it. Alright, now let's go back to the changedUpdate method and place a call to the filter method that we just created by providing the text entered in the text field. Now let's also override the insertUpdate method and place the same call in it. And let's also override the removeUpdate method and also place the same filter in it. Alright, after having done that, let's add the label to the panel we defined earlier. And to make sure we have it on the left side, we define it with a border layout west. To the right of it, meaning to the border layout center, we place the text field. Now let's add the scroll pane with the table to the frame in the center and the filter panel to the north within the frame, meaning to the top end. Let's also set the frame visible and go back to the main method to add the new table filter sort example class, which we name example2. Then we call the run method and run the application. And here we can see the new window, table filter sort example. At the very top we have our filter and below it we have the table. Now if we add J to the filter, for instance, after having done so, it will automatically filter the contents of the table where it will find the letter J. If we continue with an O, it will filter even more where it finds a JO. If we add another H, we are left with one line, which is John Doe. Nothing will change if we add an N because we'll find John, but if we add another A, the filter again takes place and nothing is left in the table. Okay, let's remove this filter input. Now we also define the sorting functionality. So let's click on the first row and right after that click on the first name column. After having done so, you can see the little triangle to the right of the column title. And also the sorting is now ascending according to the values within first name. If we click on the same column again, it turns around the sorting from ascending to descending. And we can also do the same thing with the next column, last name, in ascending or descending order. Okay, we've covered quite some ground already with this filtering and sorting example. Let's climb the ladder by another step and make sure we cover how to add and delete table rows. After all, this presents quite a central case with tables, correct? Alright, we are back to our main method. Let's start by creating a new class, table_add_delete example, in which we also add a run method. And right away we start by creating ourselves a new frame with the title table_add_delete example. Let's define the default close operation to exit on close. And then we create a new panel, which we call panel main. Let's set the layout of the panel to box layout along the y-axis. Okay, let's create a two-dimensional array for the data, having John Doe, Jane Smith, and Peter Jones. Now let's define the column names, ID, first name and last name. Then, like before, we define ourselves a new default table model in which we add the data and the column names. Okay, let's create a new method, updateRowCount, in which we start by checking whether we have a model or not. Let's quickly create a label for the row count, and then in the case we have a model, we set the text, row count, and the actual row count. Alright, let's go back to the run method and place the call to updateRowCount just below the model definition. Now we can create a new table by also providing our model. We place the table in the scroll pane, and then we are ready to define the input fields for creating a new entry. The first thing that we want to create here is a new panel for the input, in which we define a flow layout, which orients itself to the left. Then we also need another panel for the ID, followed by a new label for the ID, and a text field for the ID, and then we add both of them to the panel. After that, we repeat the whole process for the first name and for the last name. Now those are the fields for adding a new entry to the table. But after having entered values, we also need a possibility to tell the application to actually take those values and do something with it. For that we need a button. So let's add a new JButton and name it addRow, and also provide it with an action listener. In here we override the actionPerformed method, which grabs the values that we just entered, ID, first name, last name. Then we check if any of those values are empty, and if all of them have values, we create a new object array entry within the model, essentially adding a row. After having done so, we update the row count. And after that, we empty the fields. Okay, we want a common place for all those fields, so let's add them all to the panel input. Now let's create another panel, which we name Panel Summary, in which we also provide a flow layout, which points to the left. We also want to delete fields, so let's add a button for that. Button delete. And the text in the button is delete selected row. This delete button also needs an action listener, so let's add one and override the action performed method, in which we first get the selected row, and if the selected row is not -1, we tell the model that we want to remove the selected row. After having done so, we update the row count. OK, and the label and the button both need to be added to the summary panel. Now let's add the panel input, the scroll pane, and the panel summary to the panel main, and then add the panel main to the frame. This is followed by telling the frame to pack everything and set the frame visible. Now let's go back to the main method and add the class that we just created, table add delete example. We name it example3, then we call the run method, and then we run the application. And here we can see our results. Table add delete example. At the very top we have our fields for adding a new row. Below that we have the table, and at the very bottom we have the current row count and the delete selected row button. Now if we fill the top fields with values ID4, Mia, Wilson, and then hit the button add row, we can see that after having done so the fields are empty and the table has a new row. And also at the very bottom the row count is now 4. If we click on the third row, Peter Jones, and after that we hit the button delete selected row, we remain with 3 rows, and the label at the bottom shows row count 3. Alright, to sum up, these 3 examples demonstrate the fundamental concept of tables when creating a Java GUI with Swing. We've explored a basic table example to get a first look at what we're dealing with. We also made sure we understand how to filter and sort, and also how to add and remove table rows. You are now ready to create Java GUIs with tables that you fill with your own data. To learn more about Java GUIs, refer to my Java GUI playlist, which is regularly updated with new content. Links to both the playlist and the GitHub repository for code are provided in the description of this video. Do you have a clearer understanding of Java tables now? If this video was helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. This is the best way to get notified for future content just like this one. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Gene. See you in the next video.